Okay. Oh, I know what I did. I muted myself on Discord, but not on OBS, so that's why Renegade can hear my clicking in the background. Okay.
Sure, it wasn't too distracting though.
No. You need to turn yourself down a little bit there, Jeff, I think.
Oh yeah? Okay.
Yeah, Final, you're still spiking a bit there.
Oh yeah?
Into the red. That's better. Yeah, Final Fantasy VII, great game. But extremely Gnostic.
Okay. As a lot of video games are.
Well, I think the Final Fantasy series is incredibly Gnostic.
Yeah.
In particular. So.
Speaking of that, our friend Nathan Smith, friend of the channel, personal friend, he's doing a live stream over on his channel, Nathan Rakesmith, about the most Gnostic game of all time, which is the Talos Principle. I think that's the name of it.
Right now?
He might have just finished. I don't know.
Wow. Go and check that out after this one.
Yeah.
We're fighting for a lot of streams tonight. With a lot of streams tonight.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh well. But this is.
There's a question here. Should we do questions or
Sure.
There's a question
I'm happy
in
to
the
do
chat.
questions throughout the whole thing.
Yeah. He says, "Are you familiar with the Soviet OGAS system? It was an attempt at a Soviet internet of sorts to elevate the complexity of the free market to the complexity."
Yeah, sort of.
Yeah.
I am
saw
a little
video
bit
about this the other day. Yeah.
There's a.
Yeah.
Oh, do you know about it?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. Well, shall I just say what I know first, and then you?
Okay,
go?
yeah.
Because I think you'll know more.
I've only seen one video about it.
But it's it's an effort to set prices, right? Instead of letting the market set prices.
It was described as a nervous system for the Soviet economy.
What I'll say is I'm speaking objectively here. I don't think that there's any reason why a command economy inherently has to fail if it has the technology behind it to operate. And it seems. Well, I'm just saying. I don't know. On the face of it, it's not obvious that it wouldn't work. Assuming you had.
If Lotto was in the chat, we would go down a whole von Mises rabbit hole about ordinal preference versus cardinal.
Well, I don't even know what that means, but
it's something for another time.
If what the economy is supposed to be doing is setting prices in an efficient way, well, I don't see why you couldn't have a system like that. It's just that the Soviets couldn't get that in place before they collapsed, and I also assume that probably the Soviet economy was too incomplete to ever properly function by itself. We're going to talk about that tonight. We're going to talk about that tonight, though.
And there were numerous interests that did not want the OGAS system put in.
Well, okay,
especially
sure.
the military.
Yeah. So the closest thing that comes to
bureaucracy.
The closest thing that comes to it that I know of, there's incidentally, there's an excellent book called Red Plenty. I can't remember who wrote it, but Red Plenty is sort of like a series of little essays, but told through the eyes of fictional characters about the Soviet economy and how it didn't work. It's a really weird book, but it's really interesting, and they do talk about that system at some length. But as far as I know, the only place that ever really tried it was Chile under Allende before Pinochet showed up, and it was done by a guy who is named sometimes Stafford Beer, sometimes Greg Beer. I think his name is like Gregory Stafford Beer or Stafford Gregory Beer, but you see both. And of course, Allende drives it into the ground, and before Greg Beer can ever really get it off the ground. Greg Beer is part of something called, he's very big in the Second World War in the British military in something called organizational research. And organizational research is something that we're going to come back to in just a few chapters. And I think when Quigley starts talking about organizational research, things really get off the ground. It's sort of like the formalization of managerialism. And Britain is the country in the world during the Second World War that most efficiently mobilizes its economy for the war. It's not as big as America, but in terms of percentages mobilized because of organizational research, Britain really leads the way. Stafford Beer is a big part of that. He tries to take it to Chile. It doesn't work, or he doesn't get the chance to do it before Pinochet shows up, and I would venture that Pinochet saves us all a lot of grief. But go on, Jeff. What do you know about it? Because
regarding Stafford Beer and cybernetics, I mean, one of the kind of core ideas of cybernetics is systems that regulate themselves and they become automated. Yeah. And there's this kind of strange irony in that it didn't work in the Soviet Union, but it was actually, the free market actually gives more. There's a strange irony in which the free market, in a way, is more amenable towards cybernetics than the Soviet Union is. Well, whereas the Soviet Union kind of had these local politics and bureaucracies that did not want to connect onto this totalizing automated system.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. But that's the problem of the personalities. Whereas capitalism, the almighty dollar can overcome personalities.
Yeah, exactly. It's so weird because in America you hear about individualism and personalities. You think these oil barons and whatever are all personalities, but really capitalism actually gives more way to impersonalism than the Soviet bureaucracy does. Yeah.
The thing about cybernetics, though, it like cybernetics would say, well, cybernetics does work. You're regulated. You as an entity are an example of a cybernetic system working. We just haven't really figured out how to apply cybernetics to fully automate self-regulating man-made machines. But there's cybernetic non-man-made machines that work really well for a number of years, but we're working on how to make a man-made machine operate with these principles of cybernetics.
Yeah. Well, if you think about it, the majority of systems do have this element of self-regulation.
Well, they do by definition. Because if they didn't have that self-regulation, they wouldn't exist long as a system. Yeah. So, yeah, ask me about cybernetics in about 6 months when I've read everything.
You're writing a paper on it?
Maybe. We'll see. So, today, though... Oh, was that all you wanted to say about... was it OG?
Yeah, there's more, but then I don't want to go too far into that.
Yeah, it's not really this. It's a great question. I'll see at some point. I'd love to do something about it because it's fascinating. But this is Quigley, and Quigley was writing in the '60s before this sort of stuff is even really getting anywhere. I would say what Quigley talks about in relation to this is in operational research, which we'll come to. And in a way, operational research is sort of what Alul would call technique. Yeah. So if you've been reading Elul with the book club, you'll know a little bit about that. But
That's right. Post the link to our Discord. Oh, but we're all already halfway through Elul anyway. But you can join us for the next book or the end of Technological Society if you want.
Or even read it, and then, like, I'm sure if you want to keep talking about it, there'll be more than enough people interested in talking about it. But today we're doing, let's see here. Doing a little bit of back to Quigley. It's been a little bit chaotic here, but hopefully back on into a bit of a routine. Is it coming up? I have this problem every time, and I can't figure out what it is that is doing it.
We've forgotten how we solved it last time, too.
I just closed it and opened it again.
Okay.
Ugh. Hold on. All right. Again,
Do I sound different, by the way?
do you have a new mic?
No, it's a new chair, actually.
Oh,
backed this Kickstarter campaign about 18 months ago or something, and the thing was dead in the water, but somehow he figured out his production line, and he finally delivered on this new office chair. And it's I don't know how to describe it. It's like a spaceship. The thing like unfolds in many different ways. I shouldn't say it's a spaceship because actually it's quite a sleek design. It's quite a simplistic, organic design, but it's pretty fancy.
And you're comfortable.
So
are you?
I think it's fixing my posture. So I'm hoping that translates to more resonance in my voice.
Yeah. All right.
King of Vinland has a follow-up question. Would you agree that something like the Soviet OGAS would lend itself to technocracy?
Yeah.
But yes, but the point that I was trying to make is also that capitalism also leads to technocracy. And I think Elul would say that because both like socialist politics and free market liberal politics are both being guided by technical proficiency rather than truly their ideology in itself. So, you know, you hear this a lot where it's like the left and right are two sides of the same coin, that kind of stuff. And what Jacques Ellul would say is because there is no real politics anymore due to like the kind of age of technology that we've entered into. And instead, all we have now is technique guiding our politics. Or guiding the way that civilization organizes itself. And then, are you still fixing the thing?
No, I'm ready. I think I'm.
Oh, you ready? Okay. Well, Jacques Ellul has also this other point about. Actually, I forget. Go on.
Well, I don't. I wasn't really listening. I was just getting this sorted, okay. But I've got it all sorted now.
Yeah, Renegade says that if you don't do the most efficient thing, other countries will outcompete you. And exactly, that's like the kind of they're calling this the Moloch problem now, or the Moloch dilemma in game theory, which is that if you don't play a certain game, then you're gonna most certainly be eliminated. It's like musical chairs.
And I would assume with something like OGAS, the problem is not so much will it work, so much as when is it worth implementing. Because if you implement it too early, you're going to pay for all the like beta testing and go through all the sort of initial problems. And so I assume it's the sort of thing like, well, what would a country like, Czech Republic do? Well, they'll wait and see how well like China does, and they'll take what works in China and what doesn't, and discard what doesn't work. So like there's like innovation hurdles. So you want to be in the middle of the pack in adopting it, I would assume, because you also don't want to be the last country to adopt it.
Yeah, so the OGAS system might not have been the most technically proficient system to implement, either now or at that time. And you can see that what's coming, what they're talking about with like stakeholder capitalism, like that is a probably more proficient, technically proficient system that has the same like technocratic effect.
Yeah. Well, everything that's happening in the West seems to be oriented towards that. But we won't dwell on problems of the West in 2023 because we got to worry about the problems of the Soviet Union in the first half of the 20th century today. So yeah, this is chapter 8. This is episode 6 of Quigley's Tragedy and Hope. Chapter 8, International Socialism and the Soviet Challenge. Not a lot of slides today, but yeah, I've got a couple of pages here to talk about. It's an important chapter in that it sort of sets up, of course, the West's main competitor in the period that Quigley's writing, and so it's worth going a bit deeper, which means a few less slides, but Quigley has very long chapters even for his shortest. So yeah, but yeah, a Bucklander lecture series. But just to recap, right? We have significant economic mismanagement in the West. This comes about as a result of countries trying to cling on to the gold standard in some form or another, and being tied up with their currency's value. This is largely influenced by the bankers who are manipulating these sorts of economies in their own interests, because they're very tied to the value of money and increasing the value of money compared to goods. And a great way to do that is deflation and using gold to do that. So there's a lot of economic mismanagement. Britain has a lost decade. America goes through the Great Depression because of these issues. And weirdly, to like the modern English speaker, like France does really well because France is happy to sort of like sit in the middle of two different policies, and it lets its currency get devalued and then keeps it artificially devalued. So it does really well in terms of exports, and it sets itself up well, although not well enough to see off the invasion of 1940. Yeah, and as I say, chasing the gold standard. I'm hoping to come back to this in a couple of months. I'm reading some stuff. There's a new book out called by I think he's Yale. His name is Mark Doughton, and he's written a book called The Economic Government of the World, 1923 to 2023. So I'm very interested in that. It's interesting perspective, because it's specifically like the economic global financial systems that emerge, and yeah, it's super super interesting if you're a nerd. And so today we're looking at a couple of things with regard to the USSR and communism. The international socialist movement, how communism itself emerges, the Bolshevik Revolution, and Stalinism itself, and sort of what happens in the build-up to the Second World War domestically for Russia.
And what is Quigley's overall opinion about international socialism?
That it's bad. Not that like redistributive economics is bad, but that the Russians are bad at it. I assume Quigley would kind of be like vaguely like a social democrat in terms of like his views of economics. So like he likes I assume he kind of likes the free market, but we need like safety nets. I mean, I think he's pretty fairly represented by someone like Elizabeth Warren, I would assume, that sort of position.
Yeah, it's a fairly common position.
Yeah. I don't know though, because he is also writing in 63, so he's a bit more conservative about it. But I think he does say at one point when he's talking about the petty bourgeois, that it's sort of a shame the petty bourgeois doesn't become socialist, but sort of becomes reactionary. So something like that, yeah. But yeah, so there's a sort of history of socialism. So this is now properly beginning. The history of sort of socialistic thought prior to Marx is captured in various sort of utopian pieces. No one sat down and formalized how to make this work. In theory, no one's given us a model. No one's given us like a theory of history. It's all very utopian, and I think that this is one of the things, like your English teacher or someone will tell you that, like, well, people who write utopian stuff know that it will never happen. What they're sort of doing like a social essay as much as anything else, and they just want to like talk about ideas, what's going wrong, what could be done better. Marxism throws that sort of out the window, and I think one of the ways you could describe Marxism is like a genuine attempt to implement utopianism. After 1848, you no longer really get that sort of idealistic utopianism. You're now in the age of socialism, and of course, what's 1848? It's Marx and Engels putting out the Communist Manifesto. Now, just a note: if a communist somehow stumbles across this video, and I do a bad job at representing what you think communism actually is, please don't tell me. I don't care, and keep it to yourself. I'm not interested. I really am not interested in like. Well, actually, this is what Quigley says. It's not even what I say, but I'm not really interested if this is not your.
I'm pretty sure that leftists equally don't want to hear where the real church is. They don't want to hear a Protestant and a Catholic and an Orthodox argue about that.
Yeah. Good, yeah, true. We get 4 sort of like vague positions that come out of post 1848. We have the anarchist, which is sort of like Bakunin. Now, anarchism says, to put it really simply, state bad, man good. So the state is keeping us down. It's forcing us into sort of artificial relationships. We need to get rid of the state. Don't ask me what they think should come next, because I know the same thing you know, which is like, so we're going to get rid of the state and we're going to implement like the people who are going to function like a state. The one that I find most plausible of all the socialist movements is the next one, syndicalism. Syndicalism agrees that the state is bad, but it's a bit more agnostic about whether man is good. So there's this sort of dividing line here. You got anarchists and syndicalists on one side and socialists and Marxists on the other. And the disagreement they have is the state good? Syndicalism is voluntarism. It says, like, people will gradually sort of move into these unions, and then one day we can have like a great union strike that destroys capitalism, and we can implement our syndicalist utopia. I have the most respect for this position because it seems to be the most peaceful and voluntarist, and sort of if I were to be a socialist, I'd be a syndicalist.
Some of this stuff sounds a lot like anarcho-capitalism.
Yeah.
Maybe with slightly different means of getting there, but...
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. I have no comment. Socialists emerge as well, and this is sort of like a left to right sort of view of them, because the next we have communists, right? So what I've done here in 1, 2, 3, 4. 1 is the most sort of anarchic and free, and 4 is the most statist. Socialists sort of come along, and really what socialists are reformers of Marxism. They're the ones who are like, well, look, Marx got off to a good start. He said some interesting things, but we need to work on them. We need to reform some things. I said syndicalism is what I sort of appreciate the most. When I tell you in a little bit, I think you'll see why socialism is the most like implementable, because it's the most pragmatic. It's not going to get rid of the state, and it can address the oversights that Marx had. Communists are very committed to what Marx said. They're ideologically committed. They're the ideological Marxists, whereas the socialists are like the pragmatic Marxists. And what do I have?
Kingdom of Vinland asks, where do you put technocracy on this scale? Or is technocracy some kind of offshoot of the attempt to implement communism?
Yeah, I don't know that you need technocracy to be one thing or the other. In terms of economics, I think you can have technocracy be sort of operate off the back of any number of systems. Technocracy I don't take to be an economic system.
Well, one of the features of technocracy that I think is very key is this idea of the perfectly calculable society. So one of the problems that you find in Marxism and also in liberalism is like there's this human factor that's incalculable, and yet the managers and the elites of the society want to turn that incalculable human factor into something quantifiable, and that's where technocracy emerges out of.
But you can get that.
Trying to solve a technical problem.
Yeah, but I think you can get that by capitalism as well.
Exactly, yeah.
So, yeah. So, Marx thought that the revolution was going to be inevitably successful. Karl Popper, in his often criticized Marxism, he said Marxism portrays itself as a science, but it isn't a science because it's constantly moving the goalposts, and it's constantly saying, well, under these conditions, the revolution will happen. Where the revolution is 5 years away, or it's 10 years away. And then 10 years later, they can sort of fall back and they can say, well, no, but yeah, I see where we went wrong. This didn't happen. This needed to happen. We're 10 years away. So they're constantly moving it. And if you talk to a Marxist, they really believe the revolution is going to happen. It doesn't matter how much counter to the narrative has to happen. The revolution isn't going to happen. And if it does ever happen, it's not going to be led by the people they think it's going to be led by. So Marx misses a number of details. So within communism, Marxism comes to dominate. And I should just say, for those who don't know, the view is that history is like this one long story of class conflicts between those who have and those who don't, and the way that those who don't sort of are enslaved by those who do. And the view is that, revolution will happen in the most industrialized countries. And this will then lead us to the system where there will be for a while, there will be a dictatorship of the proletariat, in which the lower classes are in charge. And then, at a certain point, we'll emerge from that into a genuinely classless society. Now, Quigley says that that Marx fails to anticipate a number of things. One is labor unions, the way that unions will sort of change the way that they behave. Workers' political parties who get elected and then start to wheel and deal. The way that bourgeois reformers will not really infiltrate, but try to work with these movements. These are sort of like the do-gooders who are like, won't somebody think of the children? Stuff like that. Rising standards of living. Marx didn't really anticipate that as industrialism continued, that... Sorry, I'm just trying to get comfortable. That that the capitalist pigs would share the wealth. He also significantly failed to anticipate the concept of shared ownership. And he failed to anticipate nationalism and how the lower and working classes would respond to nationalism. And so all these things, he sort of fails to think about, to properly anticipate how the working class is going to respond to these things. Now, there's a really interesting thing that happens that we don't really know about, that Quigley points out, which is that there's far from being in competition with one another, there's an alliance that develops between unions and capital, and what they do is actually, for capital's sake, unionized labor is quite convenient because it gives them a sort of a unified entity to negotiate with. It's sort of, you can go to the shop foreman as the sort of the face of labor and negotiate with him. What they do is they make an alliance against the middle class, and the standards of living rise for labor, but they do not rise really for the middle class in the same way. And it's because in order to pay them what they want, the owners of capital pass on the increase in prices to the consumers, the middle class. And the middle class are the ones who pay for everything. They pay for these the increase in standards. They pay for the profits that go to the capitalists, and they pay for the profits. They pay for the labor, the increase in living that the lower classes get. And one of the ways that this happens is that there's an increase. So you kind of get the middle class coming into this process later on via managerialism. But before then, what you have is a very strong reaction by the petty bourgeois forces in countries that don't. This is what I talked about, the reference Quigley makes where he kind of shows his hand. They don't become cosmopolitan. They don't love everything that's happening to them. They become nationalistic. They become, if you want to know who voted, where the base of support of reactionary movements in Europe were in the interwar period, it was the lower white collar guys. It was the lower bureaucrats, the postmen, the people who increasingly all that they had was some sort of social prestige from their jobs and not the compensation that ought to go with the training and the education that ought to go with it. We're in a very similar position now, and I am sort of expecting the same thing to happen. But I think a very similar thing is happening right now. So the lower white collar people become reactionary. This then.
So do you think it's not really accurate to lump every working class person into a proletariat lump, but rather that there is this distinction between different types of industries or types of jobs that people do, some which benefit from
I don't think this is the
and industrialization comes on.
Yeah, I don't think this is the question that you're asking, but let me say this. In the UK, there's a big distinction between lower class and working class. Working class people work. Lower class people are like white trash. There's a nuanced in Britain. There's a much more nuanced level of classes than there is in America. In America, you're kind of. I didn't know any lower class people in America. I knew middle class people, and I knew I didn't really know upper class people. But by comparison to England, the people that I knew would have been called in England upper middle class. And then there's middle class, there's lower middle class, there's working class, there's lower class, there's upper class. There's many more classes. There's a lot of national papers in England, and they had these sort of like codes to them, like these class codes of like, well, if you're A1, you buy the Times or the Telegraph. If you're B2, you buy the Daily Mail. If you're C something, you buy this paper. And they played to that. They played to these. You have like the Sun. It's very much a class paper. Probably the closest comparison that an American might know about is the difference between the New York Times and the Daily Mail in New York. They're two completely different papers pitched at two completely different audiences. I do think you get the system whereby, weirdly, like what we think of as the proletariat is not really the proletariat. And in fact, maybe like Marx should have pitched to the petty bourgeois, but he doesn't. And so, I don't know.
Well, it's that meme. It's the intended audience versus the actual audience.
Yeah,
It's a really popular. Yeah.
well, and the petty bourgeois sit there and they go, you know what? Maybe a revolution is what we need. Not in the way Marx wanted it, but we're gonna take what is owed to us, right? Like, and wrapped up in that is a lot of nationalism, because one of the things that's owed to us is our country. Now you can, and if you think that your country is being taken away from you, well, we're going to take our country back. They're not really interested in giving people things that they don't think it belongs to. But they certainly adopt that revolution mindset, which is they're counter-revolutionaries, they're reactionaries. And what that means, you could think of it as like, well, they're resisting the revolution. That's one way of thinking about it. Another way of thinking about it is, no, we want a revolution, but not a left-wing revolution, a right-wing revolution. That's another way of thinking about counter-revolutionaries. And perhaps a better way of saying it is that's what a reactionary is, whereas a counter-revolutionary or a white is a genuine like counter-revolutionary, and a fascist is a right-wing revolutionary. So
Jacques Ellul makes a really interesting point about some of this stuff too, which is that his claim, and I don't know how verifiable it is, but he claims that prior to Karl Marx coming onto the scene, a lot of socialist and anarchist thought was about actually man's alienation and like a spiritual battle between industrialist and working class people.
Yeah.
That all of this technology was affecting like the core of our being in a very spiritual way.
If you want to read,
when Marx comes along, he says, yeah. So when Marx comes along, he changes all of that to economic conditions, and so that spiritual element is kind of cast out for Marx, like quote unquote science, right?
My favorite book, and I challenge anyone to read this and not feel a little bit socialist. My favorite book on this sort of stuff is The News from Nowhere, about a guy who like falls asleep in London circa like 1880s, and all of it's awful and the poverty and blah blah blah, and he wakes up and he's in like this very socialist England where everybody just does what they want, and you know, people enjoy going and harvesting the wheat and doing these things. And it's a very much a spiritual book about like not them no longer being enslaved to these industrial processes. It's a very appealing book, and it's written in response to a similar book written by an American who writes a very industrial book in the same way, where some guy falls asleep in like New York or Chicago, and he wakes up and like there's just machines everywhere, and it's great, and isn't this awesome? And William Morris writes The News from Nowhere to sort of do a similar thing, but like no, we don't need machines everywhere. We need to like get back to our humanity, and if this sort of, in a way, I think one of the things he's saying, like, if this movement isn't taking us towards us liberating ourselves from the machines, then there's really no point in it. It's a great book. William Morris was part of what's called the arts and crafts movement, very influenced by John Ruskin, John Ruskin influenced Toynbee the Elder, who, of course, influenced Toynbee the Younger, his son or his nephew. And Toynbee the Younger is what Quigley is adapting. Quigley is adapting Toynbee's work. So, there's an interesting intellectual connection there between William Morris and Quigley. I'm not saying that Quigley's influenced by it at all, or that Quigley even knew about William Morris. But yeah, it's an interesting. These people are thinking about these things in the late 19th century. These are the rich do-gooders who look at socialism and they say, yes, in a very sort of patronizing way, like, we really ought to do something about these slums and these men who drink all day. They spend their pay on alcohol and they come back and beat their wives and put a 15th child into their wives, and there's too many of them, and you get sort of Planned Parenthood comes out of that sort of this similar sort of, we really ought to do something. So this sort of nationalism and these sort of reaction sort of feeds into the First World War. This nationalism of the petty bourgeois. Now, one of the hopes is that with the First World War, that the workers of the world will unite, and with their power, because they're so dependent upon by the systems warring with one another, they're going to stop working in the factories and they're going to stop fighting in the trenches, and by doing so, they're going to bring about the revolution, or like either peacefully or forcefully. But that doesn't happen because the working class, I mean, they also adopt nationalism, and they're very happy to go and fight in the trenches for 4 and a bit years. Not very happy, but they do it. There's a couple of guys that see their moment, and one of them is Lenin. And there's a number of extremists who don't go and fight in the trenches. They go to jail or they go into exile. And Lenin's waiting for his moment, and the Germans use him, and they send him to Russia. They fund him, and they get him back into Russia. Excuse me. So this brings...
What purpose?
To destabilize Russia, because they're at war with Russia.
Okay.
So for Russia, things are going okay. Russia's holding itself together. It doesn't do well militarily. You only need to look at the Battle of Tannenberg to see that, where the Germans really do a number on the Russians. It is just to give an idea. It's fairly early in the war, and yeah, it's fought over like a week, and the Germans field 150,000 men. The Russians field 230,000 men. The Germans have casualties of around 14,000 dead, or 14,000 dead, wounded, or missing. And the Russians have casualties of about 10 times that. Somewhere between 120 to 170,000 killed, wounded, or missing. That is a big, big loss. It's kind of amazing Russia holds on after that for another 2 or 3 years. What does this say? Yeah, so the revolution really gets going in the winter of 1916-17, you have a number of things happening. Quigley credits a sort of a dissatisfaction, not insignificantly, over the role of the Tsarina and Rasputin. That the people sort of know that something's going on that's a bit not good. There are food shortages at this time, and what really happens is there's Petrograd riots, which I think certain army units revolt, and this sort of starts like a sort of a series of chain reactions. The Duma is disbanded, which is the parliament. It's disbanded, but it refuses to go anywhere. It continues to fight the war, and there's one significant socialist involved, Prince Kerensky or something like that. And he eventually resigns from the government because they're so committed to keeping the war going. But one of the things that happens is, like, sort of goodwill gestures. Socialists are released from prison and returned from exiles. And what happens is that they start forming these assemblies of workers, which is what Soviet means, right? And you have these, like, parallel governments forming in opposition to the Duma. One thing clearly doesn't really talk about, but in this chapter, but the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk happens, and a huge amount of territory is given to Germany. Enormous, really, like, and Austria. Now the Allies undo this to a large extent after at Versailles. They go, no, Germany can't have that. I don't know if they actually give anything back to Russia, or if they just give that stuff to new countries. I think they must give that stuff to new countries. But the Bolsheviks do well in this sort of period of chaos of the Civil War, because they've got a really good sense of themselves. They know what they are, they know what they're after, and they're able to sort of stay committed to their brand, as it were. They're small, but they're aggressive, and they're well-defined. And what they're trying to do is buy time until what they expect to happen will happen, which is a German revolution. The whole model of revolutions was that it's kind of weird that this is happening in Russia. It should be happening in Britain or Germany, but it doesn't. Largely because the British and Germans' systems take care of their workers to a much better degree than the Russian system does. Now, that never happens, right? There's a Spartacus revolution in Germany, but it doesn't get off outside of Munich. There's really only like one successful country that has a revolution, and that's Hungary, but very quickly, like, you know, Hungary is a super Catholic country, if you don't know, and Catholics don't like communists, to put it mildly, unless you're a South American liberation theology guy.
Operation Gladio, I highly recommend that book to, Anyway.
What's Operation
Gladio? It kind of ties into a lot of this. Operation Gladio is the Catholic Church was so on board with the CIA's project to fight communism that they decided to get involved in money laundering schemes with them.
Right.
And also they also started to get involved with the Sicilian mafia and Freemasonic lodges, propaganda due.
Yeah, wow. So I'm just going to make a note of that. Operation Gladio. There's a few operations that I hear about that I always forget. Operation Paperclip is the other big one, right? So the revolution never shows up. We're going to come back to that. But one of the things that happens throughout this period is that by 1917, the industrial sort of productivity of Russia is 13% of what it was in 1913. The Russian economy is destroyed. You have inflation happening. Agricultural output collapses in part due to a drought. 5 million people die. One of the things that happens is if you're a farmer in situations like this, with uncertainty, well, you only plant enough that you need to for yourself. There's not much point planting more than that, especially if the prices for things are quite low. It's not in your interest. And if you own your land, you don't have any debts, you don't really need to worry about it. You just need to get by until prices come back. So that's one of the things. Farmers reduce production, and then a drought hits. And throughout this, because of their sort of sense of themselves, the Bolsheviks just eliminate the opposition one by one. And they're very good at rewarding those who are loyal. So the Red Army, as like this paramilitary and later like military, fully fledged military unit, does well because is popular because Jeff, I'm getting some white noise off of you. I don't know what it is, but it just started about 10 seconds ago.
Okay. I'm actually muted.
Oh. Well, it's gone now. So the Red Army attracts volunteers because they're really well fed in comparison to anyone else, and they're really well paid. The Bolsheviks know, like, we got to look after these guys. And throughout this, the peasants remain neutral. They're like, we don't know who we want to side with. We're not. No one has ever looked after us. And in doing so, they invite. They allow the Red Army, the Bolsheviks, to win, which is going to be really bad for them. They should have helped literally anybody else. And one of the things that happens is the Red Army will show up and it will demand food from the peasants, and the poor peasants will push the food requisition demands onto the richer peasants. It's like, yeah, it's starting to get a bit of payback. They can't resist this opportunity to sort of eliminate some of their own burden and put it onto those guys who've done well. There's various white resistance groups that form. There's a government out in the East, international intervention. The Japanese and Americans land in the East. There's a British force, I think French as well, that lands in Archangel. And the Red Army fights back. A big thing that happens in the West is newly independent Poland pushes east quite a ways. It conquers like 150 miles eastwards into what was like Russia, and just takes a huge chunk of Russia for itself. And it gets quite a lot of like Belarusians and Ukrainians now in Poland. I think they're pushed back later. Or maybe, I can't remember. But this is one of the reasons why Stalin's very happy to jump on Poland in 1939. As the war continues, as the revolution continues, one of the things the Bolsheviks do is they declare that agricultural crops are national property, so they can just take what they want in terms of food. Factories of over 5 workers get nationalized. This is what they call war communism. It's very quickly relaxed, and you never actually get any closer to full-on communism than these first, like, a couple of months or a year or two during war communism. It's a time when the Soviet Union is the most communist. National Soviets form, national assemblies form, and of course the first is Russia. The others model themselves off of Russia. This is the war. The war's won. The what do I have here? Yeah, I've said that. Yep. And the U.S. and so the other Soviets form around Russia, the Russian Soviet, and you get the formation of the USSR. There's two sort of houses that develop in representative. You have a house based upon population, and you have a house based upon nations. So sort of like a Senate, right? You have this pyramid system of representation. So, our village will send a representative to the county Soviet. And then of the 100 guys who go to the county Soviet will send one guy to the province Soviet. And then one guy from the 100 guys that go to the province Soviet will send one guy to the National Soviet, the Russian Soviet. And then the Russian Soviet will send a number of guys to the USSR Congress. This is a really good way of eliminating public will whilst having some sort of like something that looks like democracy. And you kind of have a system that emerges as well out of this, where the Communist Party exists parallel to the state or society. Everybody sees Lenin's death coming, and you have a system by which Trotsky. There's 3 phases. First, it's Trotsky versus everybody. Then it's Trotsky versus Stalin. And then when Trotsky is eliminated, it's Stalin versus the rest. And I'll talk about where Trotsky sort of alienates himself from the others in a minute. The way that Trotsky is very popular with the Red Army. But that's not enough. What Stalin does is he sort of lurks in the shadows and earns favors. And there's 2 big committees in the USSR. There's the Politburo, which is worried about policy, and there's the Oro Bureau, which is based on like party organization or state organization. And Stalin's the only person who's on both of those. He's very aware that he wants to be on both of those, and he uses the position on both of those to sort of start earning favor. And as I say, we'll dip back into Trotsky. But so Stalin emerges as the dominant power, and he forces Trotsky into exile. As I say, committees. Said that. Now, the German Revolution never happens. Things stabilize in Russia. The economy starts to recover. There's quite a bit of like free market going on. The state really only exerts control over arms industry and heavy industry. Light industry is allowed to sort of be run freely. The problem is that the light industry is struggling to get labor and raw material to make things with. This is a problem because you have the farmers. You have this situation where It's called a parity crisis. The price of some goods start to fall, and the price of other goods start to go up. So the price of wheat is really low, but all of the things that the farmers would want to buy are worth more because light industry has to charge more because of how it's struggling. The peasants have also been really difficult with as far as the communists are concerned, and vice versa. Peasants don't trust communism after war communism, and then this parity crisis. So, and out of this situation and this failure for the German Revolution to show up, and this sort of recovering position with the economy, you have a doctrine that develops, which is called, do I have it here? Socialism in one country. And so the view is, how do we make everything work in the USSR until the revolution shows up? Now, you wouldn't want to industrialize Russia. The whole point would be that you want the revolution to happen in other industrial places so that it then spreads. You don't want it to happen in a country that needs to industrialize in order to spread the revolution. But they have to industrialize, and they do gradually and in very inefficient ways, but they do industrialize. But really, Russia should have remained a nation of farmers. If you think about it objectively, if you want to apply communism in 1913, you wouldn't go, oh yeah, let's industrialize Russia. But it has to industrialize Russia in order to become like the arsenal of communism. But they also don't really want to go out and antagonize the rest of the world when they're weak, because they're aware that everybody else could kick the shit out of us if we're not careful. Trotsky, and where Trotsky sort of alienates himself from others, from what I gather, is that Trotsky really wanted to pursue like world revolution now. And Stalin was like, no, we need to establish control in Russia. And in order to establish control in Russia, really, this sort of makes a lot of things make sense for me. Who is the biggest domestic enemy in Russia? Well, it was the peasants. The peasants were the ones that were sitting on the fences. Everybody else had been eliminated. The peasants had sort of hummed and hawed. They were resentful of these sort of impositions on them by the Communist Party. And the peasants needed to be broken in order to make the system work. I'll come back to that in a second. The view of communism in one country is validated eventually by the German invasion in 1941. That we couldn't have trusted anybody else. We were right to sort of like shore up our own like capabilities because we had to fight against the Germans. So what happens to them is well suited. What happens to them is validates this sort of position. Quigley says that Russia's well suited to this policy as well because, the peasants suffer because Russia has a history of totalitarianism and oppressive policies, and they just start applying that to the peasants in the name of communism instead of the peasants in the name of the Tsar. Or this, if you want to know more about this, go back and watch the episode on Russia. I think it's Russia and the Buffer Fringe. Quigley talks more about it there. The system by which the history of Russia lends itself really well to these things. Now, throughout all of this, the peasantry suffers, and there isn't really enough industry or mechanization, so that becomes massively important, a big priority for them to push. They initially have a limited number of state farms, collectivized farms. But they're incredibly inefficient. They're not worth it compared to how efficient the peasants are. Now, a sane person would look at them and say, okay, well then what we should do is we should divide up the state farms and give them to make some new peasants and give them the land that we have. Is that what Russia does? Is that what Stalin does? No. What they do instead is they say, well, somehow state farms being inefficient is the fault of all the peasants that aren't on the state farms. So, and this, you see this sort of logic throughout the Soviet Union. When something goes wrong, it's not because the policy was wrong. It's because the policy's right and someone's sabotaging it because they don't want the right thing. So there's this really weird thing that comes up with this sort of like drive for what do I have? Drive for like numbers, really. You have centralization of farms to fix the problem of state farm inefficiency somehow. This leads to the liquidation of the kulaks, and as all of this is happening, as it becomes obvious that all the peasants are going sent onto state farms, what do? They kill all of their animals. And there's a huge reduction in livestock across the board in the Soviet Union. Because they're like, well, I might as well have a feast with my pig rather than let the Soviets take the pig. Stalin said that Stalin told Churchill apparently that in this process 12 million peasants died. Now, one of the things that's happening behind all this is Russia's not playing to its strengths. Russia's playing to what it needs to become strong in, which it shouldn't be, as I've said, industrialization. So they seize food. They make life really difficult for the peasants. They're trying, and one of the things they're trying to do is move peasants from the farm to factories, because they need an industrial base if they're going to be the only communist country in the world. So they feed factory workers and let the people making the food starve. It's crazy. You get what Quigley calls gigantomania, which is part of this propaganda, which is like everything's bigger and better. They're just sort of chasing numbers. They cultivate large areas that really ought not to be cultivated. They talk about the size of farms. They have this thing about like big tractors. The tractors are interesting because there's a system of like, yeah, the state farms need tractors, but they're not allowed to own tractors. There are these like tractor parks that own the tractors, and the state farms have to hire them from the tractor parks, and then it's incredibly inefficient. They're very expensive. They're very expensive for any benefit they get. And of course, as I said, as all of this is happening, all these efficiencies are happening. Is it the fault of the policy? No, it's the fault of sabotage, which they see everywhere. There's insane propaganda about everything. Like the guy who mined, 100 tons of coal in a day. It's like, well, yeah. How did he do that? Like, it's like not physically possible, unless you have this thing where, well, we had a couple of dozen tons from yesterday that we prepared, and it wasn't him, it was everybody, right? Like, it's this manipulation, and it's to like, so that, you're factory worker sits down at breakfast and opens up the paper, and he looks and he goes, oh, look, comrade, Vlad mind. I'm inspired. I don't know that anyone really ever buys it. So yeah, there's production propaganda about everything. Interestingly, there as industry sort of like picks up, what they get is a growth in the output of capital. So they're making machines that are capable of making more stuff, but you don't get a rise in consumption. So the quality of life for people isn't getting better. They're just sort of like amassing capital. And throughout all of this, there's a huge amount of paranoia about everything. There's the emergence of a parallel sort of party life that happens where the party elites enjoy, like, normal things and call them luxuries, and then people live in almost poverty and are not able, and that's normal. And there's with that paranoia goes scapegoats, and Quigley sort of closes it off, and he says that really, at the end of the day, the secret police are in charge of Russia only up till Stalin or the Politburo. And Stalin has a system where, as the head of the secret police starts to get a little bit too big for his britches, Stalin goes to his number 2 and he says, hey, get rid of number 1 and you can be number 1. And the guy does, and they never seem to learn their lesson because they're always happy to replace number 1 and become the new number 1 in state police, in the secret police. But no one ever thinks to take on Stalin. It's interesting that that like they kind of have their own economy, because if they don't like you, if they just like go, oh well, we need money. There's all these people in labor camps run by the Cheka and then the KGB, or is it NKVD? I can't remember. They change their name all the time. And so the secret police own all this labor that they hire out to other parts of the economy. Or if they like want you to stay in place, they'll garnish the wages. They'll take 10, 20, I don't know what the number is, but they take a % of the wages of people that they don't like. There are informants everywhere about everything at every level. So it's really like an incredibly paranoid state. And at some point in the 20s into 1948, there's a decline in living standards. With all this, despite all this industrializing going on, as I said, with the production of capital, it's the emphasis on the production of capital and arms. Arms are not consumed by people. It clearly is an interesting thing he says about arms, and that like they're a good way of doing like economic like market intervention, because they're a huge bit of economic activity, but they're not constructive. They're purely destructive, and only one entity consumes them, the state. So it's this weird sort of like Keynesianism via militarism that you get, and that's one of the things that's happening here. And it's sort of around 1948 that life starts to, and this is after the Second World War, right? That life starts to become improved for the average guy on the street in the Soviet Union. As I said, yeah, and Quigley says like the spy mania is sort of a legacy of Byzantium that Russia inherits. Again, if you want to know more about that, that's in the Russia episode that we did. And that's that. That's the state of the USSR in about 1939. Also I should say, Stalin liquidates huge portions of the Red Army. As I said, the Red Army is Trotsky's guys, and Stalin liquidates them. So on the outbreak of war with Germany, Russia has gotten rid of all of its best generals, so they're particularly vulnerable in the invasion. So, Jeffrey, you still there?
Yes. Is there any sense in which Russians view that as it was like they view like the whole process as worth it because at least they were on the winning side of World War II?
I mean, I'm sure. The question is like, well, okay, but where does that branching event happen that it was worth it or not worth it? Like, do you go back far enough and like, well, sure, if they hadn't been communist, what would have happened? Would they have even been in the Second World War? I don't know. It's too much of a it's too much of a counterfactual.
Counterfactual. Yeah. Yeah. Also, does Quigley mention what kind of role the other allies play in the development of politics in Russia?
Not really. I mean, they're supporting these alternate governments, but they do sort of step back at a certain point and just sort of get on with it. With the who they have when it emerges that we're gonna have communists there for a while. So it's again, I not really though. He doesn't talk about it much.
Yeah, I guess Anthony Sutton would fill in those holes.
Yeah,
those gaps. Yeah. So, give us a little bit of a teaser for the next live stream that we're going to do, which is on Thursday, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I forgot I put that. That's not that N-word. It's another N-word. The faction that emerged in 1930s Germany. Yep, a certain Austrian artist. And the German efforts to sort of rebuild after Versailles.
Renegade asked, "Did Quigley have anything good to say about the Soviet system?"
No, not that I can think of. Quigley does think like the West is the best in many ways. And he does think that like Russia's like regressive. Yeah. It's. I don't think so.
You think that Quigley is a bit of a technician in the Orwellian sense? That he sees what like good statehood as being technically proficient?
Yes. I think he thinks that we're in the age of operational research, as he calls it, and that's a good thing, but we have to still preserve a certain amount of liberalism. It's not enough to just like he Quigley wants his cake and he wants to have his cake and eat it too. I don't think Yeah, he's a liberal boomer basically. He wants to have all the good bits, and I don't think I think he knows that it can come to dominate us. But I don't really remember what he says about operational research. I think he's aware that like liberalism could go down the road that we're on now, and I don't know. I want to read him as if he were like a liberal boomer who's like, like, I don't know. I don't know what Quigley would say if he was 35 today, and he'd grown up with all of this stuff, whether he'd still be Quigley or whether he'd be somebody else. But like in one of the there's an interesting little quip that he makes in a lecture that's on YouTube, where he goes like, something something something, a guy can't make himself into a girl, and which, so like I think he's sort of like that sort of, like your mom or dad, like, I don't know about this transgenderism stuff, but things are okay, and we just gotta, we gotta just sort of, we need a bit more Reaganite policies. It's like, yeah, I don't know about that. I don't know. It's hard to say.
Lowell does make this point that liberalism and technocracy are not necessarily mutually exclusive or incompatible. That you can be a liberal within the bounds of the technocracy. So as long as your liberalism doesn't interfere with technical efficiency and progress, then you could be you have that space to be liberal.
Well, then I don't know that we're in the technocracy yet, then, because I don't think the system is concerned with efficiency. Or at least when I say that, I'm thinking about like economic efficiency. The system is concerned with a different type of efficiency. Either we're not in the technocracy yet, or the technocracy is concerned with an efficiency that is not economic. And both I could be persuaded of. And perhaps the efficiency of the technocracy is really something more like just social control, than economic output.
Yeah. Renegade says it's when different efficiencies combine together, then it's the true technocracy. Yeah. Because the other thing that Alil says is that different techniques in different domains of life develop at different rates.
Yep.
So sometimes the propaganda apparatus has to catch up with the, say, economic apparatus, or with the, educational apparatus. So there's this like difference in developments that kind of makes it seem like, oh, they don't really have everything together, which is true, because they don't really have quite the surveillance apparatus to implement what they want to implement yet, for example.
Yeah, and I think those are the sort of moments that like we look at and go like, wow, something kind of amazing happened here. Or like when we try to explain events, sort of in the reverse, like the collapse of the Roman Empire, of the Western Roman Empire, is the opposite of that. It's a number of techniques sort of falling apart. The process that happens around 1500 is a number of techniques emerging at the same time, or they're now all to hand in a way that they weren't before, and so there's a synergy that emerges from their availability.
Yeah, and Lowell actually does say that Christianity played a factor in the kind of slowing rate of technical development when the Western Roman Empire collapsed. I mean, there was this kind of like, the kind of upper class people at the time kind of took an interest in different things that were less concerned with technique. He's not saying it's the only factor, but it did play a factor.
Yeah, I gotta get to that bit.
Yeah. So Thursday's live stream kind of because there's a reason why you wanted to do both of them in the same week, right?
Yeah, I thought it was one was to get a bit back into rhythm, and the others they go together well. So, but it's largely more because I feel guilty because of the chaos of the past 3 or 4 weeks and not being able to go. So, yeah.
You want to give the audience a little view into that, what's been going on?
Moving, and then not having internet in my house, and that's all I want to say for now.
Okay.
At some point, I will dox myself. I plan on doxing myself, and I'm doing something more so than I was last year. I'm doing something very relevant to what we're talking about. I'm trying to make it as relevant as possible. So there's much more crossover in my life between what I'm doing and this stuff. Yeah.
All right, I guess we can wrap it up there.
I'll dox myself in 4 years if under a certain timeline. If you can imagine what could be done in 4 years, that's a hint. That's what I'll say. All right, yeah. Sorry, Jeff, you were wrapping it up. Anyway.
Yeah. Yep. See you back here on Thursday.
Cool. See you then.